anyone who's been paying attention to politics in the United States over the last couple months knows that immigration has become one of the big issues of the time. So if it's not the number one most important and most divisive issue, it's certainly number two or number three. Now, built into the question of immigration, and kind of hiding under the radar there, is a more subtle question of assimilation. So how do we incorporate people that want to be part of our society, into our society without destroying or warping the values and the traditions and everything that made the society what it was in the first place? So as we grapple with these questions in the modern day, this story is going to look back to the Romans, who we have modeled so much of our republic based on. Ultimately, the failure of the Romans to answer this assimilation question effectively led to something called the Social War. And the inputs, events, and after effects of the Social War destroyed the Republic. The first thing we need to go over before we start getting into the Social War is that a lot of people just think of Rome as, kind of Rome, one big entity that's united and expanding and taking over a huge territory, all that stuff. But that's not exactly true. So Rome was a city-state that, in its early development, went out and conquered the other areas in Italy. So a lot of people think of Rome as just kind of Italy. Well, not exactly, because Rome went out, they conquered other city-states, they conquered other areas in Italy, and a lot of times these cities and areas in Italy will remember kind of the bitter memories of Romans going through and essentially conquering them. And as we know from Roman conquests, these aren't always the most friendly operations. At times they can be quite brutal. So these areas in Italy that are under Roman control, we will call them the Italian allies. And a lot of times the Italian allies will have bitter resentments and memories of when Rome conquered them hundreds of years ago. So we're really going to start this story at the end of the Punic Wars in Rome, which is about the 140s BCE. At this time, Rome starts really kind of developing a toxic stew of issues that are ultimately going to lead to the destruction of the Republic, but also lead to this social war that kind of facilitates that in a number of different ways. And as the great Dan Carlin pointed out in his most recent masterpiece, it is a bit arbitrary where you draw the line when you're telling a story. So if one event leads to the next, we could follow that chain of cause and effect all the way back to the Big Bang if we wanted to. But obviously we have to draw kind of that arbitrary line somewhere, so we're going to do it at the Punic Wars here. Once Rome defeats Carthage in the Third Punic War, they are now free to essentially be the masters of the Mediterranean. So they kind of take over a whole bunch of areas after that, and they look to start expanding heavily and start absorbing people into their Roman system. And as this expansion is taking place, a whole bunch of issues are starting to develop in their own backyard. The first and most important of these toxic issues that starts getting more and more heated in this period is the issue of citizenship. So again, how do we assimilate these people into Roman society once we start conquering more and more territories? The Roman strategy had always been to go out, conquer a territory, and then within maybe 2 or 3 generations, you give them full citizenship and allow them to become, citizens of Rome. So you don't do it immediately, but over the course of a few generations, those conquered territories do become a part of the Republic. Here's historian Philip Matichek talking about this classic Roman system of integrating people into Roman society. Quote, recognizing that defeated peoples might harbor hard feelings about recent events, the Constitution instituted a special status for them. They became citizens without the vote. This made a conquered people sort of probationary Romans, entitled to the legal protection of citizenship, but unable, for example, to vote for the immediate execution of the general who had just conquered them. If a community behaved itself, and almost all of them did, then the vote would come along in a generation or two. By that time, the grandsons of the defeated were in the legions, enthusiastically expanding the Roman state yet further and forcibly recruiting yet more members of the Roman citizen body. End quote. So it kind of makes sense. You go out, you conquer an area, you tell them, hey, prove that you want to be part of Rome. Within a couple generations, they're out proving that they're part of Rome, they're in the army, they're recruiting more people. Okay, now we go ahead, give them the vote. And this strategy works for a long time, but as Rome continues to expand more and more, and as the Senate becomes more and more corrupt, which we'll get to, this strategy decreases. So why would a Senate that wants power for themselves go out and expand citizenship to voters who, quite frankly, just aren't like them? This will only serve to decrease the power of the Senate, which is something that they're not interested in. The next important issue that's kind of infecting Rome at the moment after citizenship is this idea of land displacement. Essentially, the poor people, the plebeians, are not getting what they see as their fair share of the land when these conquests are made. And more importantly, a lot of times these plebeians are getting essentially booted off their own farms, their own land, in favor of these kind of big, rich farms. So the original idea was probably a good one, just like the original idea behind the citizenship was. But as Rome expands, this original idea becomes less and less plausible. So the original plan was go out, conquer a new territory, give that land to the retired legionaries, the retired people in the army. Those people are going to have kids. They're going to farm the land. They're going to join the army once those kids grow up. They're going to conquer new lands, and then they're going to go ahead and give that land to the retired legionaries. So kind of wash, rinse, repeat. Makes sense, right? The problem is that due in large part to the corruption that we're going to talk about in a second, aristocrats, kind of the rich patricians, they're going to start becoming more and more powerful. This allows them to buy up big plots of land. They're able to afford slaves, and they're able to use some of that gold, slaves, wealth that they're acquiring from overseas, and they're able to make essentially Godfather-style offers to these plebs who have no choice but to kind of get kicked off their land or have their land get absorbed by these big, rich farmers. And what makes it even worse is that a lot of the times this is happening while those poor plebeian farmers are away fighting in war, fighting for Rome. So while they're out, busting their butts, fighting for Rome, you got these rich aristocrats coming in, buying up their farms using what amounts to essentially shady tactics. And of course, as these big rich farms start increasing, they're producing more of the kind of cash crop stuff as opposed to kind of just, your basic bread and wheat. And all of a sudden there's less food for the commoners because we have these huge farms producing cash crops, but we don't have, a lot of those smaller farms producing the food and stuff that the plebeians need. So all of a sudden they're losing their land, they don't have any citizenship, and they're starting to go hungry, which is a terrible mix. So we have the citizenship issue, and we have this land displacement issue, and kind of percolating through both of those issues, and maybe even the ultimate issue here is the corruption of the Roman government, in particular the Senate, and the Roman political elite. So here's historian Philip Matichek again summarizing the problem with corruption. Quote, the Roman political elite, which until then had seen its duty as service to the state, now increasingly adopted the view that the state existed to serve it. End quote. What he's talking about there is that once Rome conquers a new territory, guess who has control of how that territory is administered and how it's taxed and all that stuff that goes into it? It's the Roman Senate. A lot of times they would make these kind of under-the-table deals in order to set up these huge taxation, mining, exploitation operations. So when all that money, all those slaves, all that stuff is flowing from the provinces overseas into Rome, guess who gets first dibs on it? It's the senators and the people that they kind of make those deals with. Now, a lot of times those deals are made with the big aristocrats who can then have those advantages when it's time to buy up the land or when it's time to kind of take control of certain political issues. So as author Tom Holland points out, the lid of the honeypot is now well and truly off. So we're no longer conquering areas because of Roman values. We're now conquering for loot, and we're conquering for slaves, and we're conquering to increase our political status as well as our own wealth. And of course, as we pointed out, this is at the expense of a lot of times the poor and the plebeians who, in many cases, don't have the ability to vote to change the situation. Instead of existing to serve the public and to serve the people who need help in Rome, the Senate and the political elite, at least a large chunk of them, are now serving themselves. So if I had to say what are the three big issues that Rome's facing that are going to lead ultimately to the downfall of the Republic, I would say it's the citizenship issue, the land displacement issue, and the corruption issue. Every book you read, you're going to get a slightly different take on those issues. Those issues will be in every book, but it's going to be a different interpretation. So I hope the way I explain that makes a little bit of sense. I tried to kind of simplify it a little bit, but again, those are complicated issues. But what might be the real story here as far as Rome goes and as far as the Italian allies go is that all of these issues are related to this idea of the gap between the rich and the poor getting bigger. As we can see, there's going to start to be battle lines that start to develop. On the one hand, you're going to have kind of the conservative faction, oftentimes associated with the rich and the powerful. These guys are often called the optimates. And then you're going to have more of the poor people and the people who want to see these issues reformed and changed before violence and disaster breaks out. And these people are called the populares, who, ironically, will be responsible for a good chunk of the violence and disaster that breaks out. So we have ourselves a classic mix of just divisive and potentially destructive issues that are affecting Rome at this particular period. What's really important to kind of emphasize, at least as it relates to the social war, is that the Italian allies, those areas around Rome in Italy, are really getting hit hard by these issues. A lot of times these people that make up the Italian allies are legionaries in the Roman army, so they're going overseas, they're fighting for Rome, they're dominating opponents, they're enjoying, fraternization with actual Romans, and they're being treated as kind of, kings of the world overseas, and then they're coming home, and they are coming home to their farms being taken by hook or by crook. They're coming home and not being able to vote on any issues. They're coming home and seeing a corrupt political class taking advantage of them, at least in their eyes. So they're not happy. So into this mix of discontent and unhappiness, we're going to enter a man by the name of Tiberius Caracas. And Tiberius was actually the grandson of the great Scipio Africanus. And like Scipio before him, he was a military guy who was involved fighting some barbarians on the fringes of Roman territory. And at one point, Tiberius negotiates a deal with some of these barbarians in order to save about 20,000 Roman soldiers. So instead of just kind of fighting and crushing the enemy, he negotiates a deal, and he's promptly repudiated and nearly executed by the Senate, because this goes against kind of the Roman values of, we don't negotiate with the enemy, we just go out and we crush them. So Tiberius is going to escape this, with his life and political career intact, but he's going to hold an epic grudge, and Tiberius and the Senate are not going to get along from this point forward. Tiberius is going to get voted as Tribune of the Plebs. So whether Tiberius just wanted to stick it to the Senate because he hated them after they basically tried to have him lynched, or whether he wants to use this position as tribune in order to increase his own prestige and political power, or whether he actually believed in the position of trying to help out the plebs and the people who needed the help in Roman society. Nobody knows. But nonetheless, Tiberius Gracchus becomes tribune of the plebs in the year 133 BCE. So we have a pissed off Tiberius Gracchus who's going to start using the position as tribune in a way that no one's really ever used it before. As tribune, he can propose bills to the people, and he can also veto a lot of the stuff the Senate does. So what Tiberius is going to start doing is he's going to start proposing laws directly to the people and kind of getting them riled up in true demagogue fashion, and then he's just going to start vetoing the Senate if they kind of refuse to play ball with him on essentially anything. And the first order of business for Tiberius Gracchus is to get this land reform bill passed. So he wants to present a proposal that will essentially redistribute some of the land from the rich to the poor. Some of the people that are getting hurt by this whole land displacement issue are now going to be helped by this law. The problem is that it comes at the expense of the rich and the political elite. Here is Tiberius Gracchus' speech as he's kind of presenting this proposal to the common people. And this comes from Plutarch. Quote, "The wild beasts of Italy have each a cave or a lair of their own. But the men who fight and die for Italy have no part of it but the sunlight and air. With their wives and children they wander from place to place with neither hearth nor home. So the lips of their generals lie when before battle they exhort their soldiers to defend their family tombs and shrines from the enemy, because not a man of their listeners has a hereditary altar. No, not one of all these many Romans has an ancestral tomb. Instead, they fight and die to support others in wealth and luxury. Yet they are called masters of the world, these men who have not a single lump of earth to call their own." End quote. So what Tiberius is saying there is that, again, these Italian allies, these poor Romans are going out and they're fighting for Rome, and they're coming home to have their farms and their families kind of displaced because of, in their opinion, the corruption, the greed, and the wealth of the political elite. Now, the Senate is not going to take this lying down, so they see Tiberius's proposal, and they go out and they essentially veto what Tiberius does. So Tiberius says, okay, you want to veto that? I'm going to veto every single thing you guys try and do for the rest of the year. So this includes every act of government. This includes the senators being able to get paid because they have to, pass certain things to get that done. Tiberius basically grinds the government of Rome to a halt. So the Senate essentially has no choice but to go ahead and pass the law. But it's very clear that the Senate is tired of Tiberius Gracchus, and while they have no choice but to pass the law, they do have another choice. They just go kill him. Here's Plutarch again describing the murder. Quote, "The servants of the senators brought clubs and staffs from their homes, but the senators had already seized upon the legs of the benches broken by the fleeing crowd. With these they attacked those trying to shield Tiberius, slaughtering some and routing the rest. Tiberius turned to run, but his clothing was held, so he shed his toga and fled in his tunic, only to stumble and fall over some bodies on the ground in front of him. As he struggled to his feet, he took the first blow." End quote. So the senators essentially just went to one of Tiberius's little rallies, and they just killed everyone associated with him, and then they just killed Tiberius, apparently with the legs of these tables. So they just clubbed him to death. Somewhat strangely, Tiberius's law would remain in place. The senators didn't remove it immediately, and they kind of used the logic of they didn't care that much about the law, they just cared about the way Tiberius went about doing it. So whether or not that's a reasonable justification for killing him is up to interpretation, but nonetheless, the law stayed. The problem was that land reform law only applied to citizens of Rome. So the problem is that for the Italian allies, which this whole social war is going to be about, that law didn't apply to them because they weren't citizens, which is one of the things they were fighting for in the first place. after Tiberius Caracas gets murdered by the Senate, someone's going to come along by the name of Fulvius Flaccus, and he's going to try and solve this problem that I just said. So his solution is just make the Italian allies citizens. If these people are upset that, they're not getting part of this land reform bill that Tiberius Caracas proposed because they're not citizens, let's just make them citizens. Very simple. Obviously, the Senate is not going to go for this. They threaten Fulvius Flaccus just like Tiberius Caracas before him. And Flaccus, not as courageous as Tiberius, he's going to back down. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on your perspective, the Italian city of Fregale will revolt right after Fulvius Flaccus backs down. What's important about this revolt is not that it has any game-changing, geopolitical changes going on, but it shows how upset and distraught the Italian allies were, and it shows that those underlying conditions were strong enough that if one city can revolt, pretty soon a whole big chunk of cities is going to start revolting. The Senate would deal with this revolt just like it dealt with any other revolt. They go to the city, they promptly flatten it, completely destroy it, and they destroy all the people inside, and then they just so comprehensively, remove the city from the map that even archaeologists today don't know where it was because there's no physical evidence that it ever existed. Once Fulvius Flaccus goes away, the next guy to take up the cause of the Italian allies and the poor in Rome would be Gaius Caracas, the brother of Tiberius Caracas, who of course was murdered by the Senate. And in a lot of ways, Gaius Caracas is really the worst guy for this job because there's not going to be any reconciliation between him and the Senate. And in order to get these deals done, there's going to have to be compromise. But because the Senate killed Tiberius and because Gaius hated the Senate, there wasn't going to be a deal that was going to get done because neither side was willing to compromise. So Gaius Caracas proposes that the Roman system give the Italian allies what's called the Latin Rite. And the Latin Rite is essentially all the perks of Roman citizenship without the voting. So this is what we talked about earlier, where the Romans would go out and, within a couple generations, they would give the right to vote. So Gracchus was proposing, first we'll give them the Latin Rite, we'll let them have the legal protections, that sort of thing, property, qualifications, all that. And then over the course of generations, we'll slowly give them the vote. And this actually seems like a pretty sensible idea, but because he was Gaius Gracchus, the Senate was not going to go for it. In addition to being Gaius Gracchus, who was proposing this stuff, the Senate was also worried that if we bring too many people into the Roman system, it's going to screw up the whole thing. So here's a Roman aristocrat at one of these public forums kind of insulting Gaius Gracchus. Quote, "So you will give citizenship to the Latins, and afterwards do you imagine that there will be space to do as you are now doing and listen to a public meeting? Or will you find room at the games or public festivals? Why don't you stop and think? If you did, you'd see that they will crowd you out of everything." End quote. And that comes from Cicero later on in time. But the idea is that the Senate was worried that enfranchising all these Italian allies was going to slowly crowd out the traditional pillars of power in the Roman society. Ultimately, the Senate is going to outpolitic Gaius Gracchus. They're going to defeat him and the laws he's trying to propose. And furthermore, what's going to happen next is something that will influence the rest of Rome's history forever. Essentially, the Senate and the consuls at the time get together and they decide to purge anyone who has ever supported Gaius Gracchus or his brother Tiberius before him. So thousands of Gracchus supporters would be rounded up, killed, executed. Their families would be unable to mourn them. And this was how the Roman Senate was going to deal with this issue of demagogues and populares and people trying to get the Italian allies enfranchised. Here's Philip Matacek essentially describing what happens with the purge here. Quote, Some 3,000 Gracchan supporters were arbitrarily sentenced to death in kangaroo courts. As he had done with Fregale, Opimius, who was the consul at the time, was thorough and merciless. The property of the slain was confiscated by the public treasury, and wives were forbidden to go into mourning. Then, to add insult to injury, Opimius used the confiscated funds to erect a temple of Concord in the Forum by way of a victory monument. So the consuls and senate just wipe out any Gracchan supporters. They take their funds, they take their money, and they use it to erect a temple for their newfound victory. If you don't think that this is going to leave some battle scars and leave some memories and leave some bitterness in the Roman public, you're wrong, because it will. Gaius Caracas himself would essentially commit suicide while on the run, and any more talk of land reform or citizenship reform was squashed for the next couple decades. But the seeds of destruction and the toxic stew that we talked about earlier in the episode, that's not going to go away. So those seeds were planted by the Gracchi brothers, and they were sowed by a stubborn and short-sighted Senate, and ultimately that's going to turn into a ruinous period for the Roman Republic, and ironically, the very people who were celebrating victory after the Gracchus supporters were killed. If you like this episode of the podcast, or any of the previous episodes, you can leave a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to it on. I'm told this helps spread the podcast to people who might be interested in listening to it somehow. So that would be fantastic if you could do that. If you didn't like the episode, you can leave me an angry tweet and we can talk about why it was terrible. Ultimately, I'm just glad you're out there listening. So that being said, thanks for listening.